Did you know that you can get paid to read books all day? It's true, it's what I do, and I love my job as a book coach. But I'll be the first to admit it's not the easiest career to get started in if you don't have a roadmap to follow. Luckily, Author Accelerator has a fantastic book coach certification program that will teach you the essential skills for helping writers reach their writing and publishing goals. They've certified more than 200 coaches all over the world and can teach you how to build your book coaching business too. So if you're even a little bit interested in becoming a book coach, head over to savannahgilbo.com/coach to learn more.
But when we can use mindfulness to recognize or even bring to mind, like if I'm writing a character who is really angry, I will do just a short meditation where I sit quietly and try to remember a time I was really angry and then stay with it long enough to write down the words that describe that emotion. Like, what does it feel like in your body when you're really angry or really sad or really in love or whatever that emotion is? We need to be able to slow down and recognize those emotions.
Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. My name is Savannah Gilbo, and I'm here to help you write a story that works. I want to prove to you that writing a novel doesn't have to be overwhelming. So each week, I'll bring you a brand new episode with simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing right away. So whether you're brand new to writing or more of a seasoned author looking to improve your craft, this podcast is for you. So pick up a pen and let's get started. In today's episode, we're going to talk about 6 ways mindfulness can make you a happier and more productive writer. If you've ever felt frustrated with your progress, or if you've ever thought there has to be a better way to write a book without making yourself miserable, because let's be honest, writing can be super fun, but it can also be super frustrating and discouraging sometimes too, right? If you've ever felt any of those feelings, or if you just want to feel more grounded in your writing practice, you're going to love today's episode. And with me today, I have April Dávila, who is an award-winning author, speaker, and writing coach. Publishers Weekly called her debut novel, 142 Ostriches, a vivid, uplifting debut, and the book went on to win the Willa Award for Women Writing the West. She's also a certified mindfulness instructor who teaches writers to integrate meditation into their writing practice. In the episode, you'll hear us talk about how developing a mindfulness practice changed April's writing life. Today, she teaches 6 ways that integrating mindfulness into her writing practice helped her to push past writer's block, write fewer drafts, craft more compelling characters, and so much more. April's going to share those 6 things with us today and give you some practical tips along the way. So without further ado, let's dive right into my conversation with April Dávila that's all about the 6 ways mindfulness can make you a happier and more productive writer. Hi, April. Welcome to the Fiction Writing Made Easy podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to join you.
I'm super excited because we're going to talk about mindfulness, specifically 6 ways that mindfulness helps you to become a happier, more productive writer. But before we get into those juicy details, in your own words, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I am a fiction writer. I'm an award-winning, traditionally published fiction writer, and I tend to write in the mornings on my own work, and then in the afternoons, I work with other fiction writers to help them figure out their novels, get their works published. And I love talking about writing and books and all of it. So yeah, that's pretty much all I do.
Love it. Yeah, and you're like a fiction nerd, right? I love it. Me too.
Yes.
We're going to link to where we can find you and all that in the show notes. But I love that. So you're obsessed with fiction. You found this track of mindfulness and how it helps you kind of unlock your potential when it comes to writing fiction. But How did you get to that point? So what was life like before that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for a long time, I really struggled. I went back to school so I got my undergraduate degree in biology, but then in 2010 decided I really wanted to be a writer. I'd been writing as a hobby for a long time, went back to school, and for another 6 years, I really struggled. I could not figure out the novel. My short stories were just rejected over and over and over again. And I was like, what am I doing? And then around 2016, something started to shift where everything just kind of started working, right? I figured out the novel. I got an agent. We sold the book. It won an award. My short stories started getting published. I was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. It just has been, everything shifted. And when I kind of turned around and looked at, okay, what did I start doing differently in 2016? One of the main things that I'd started doing was meditating regularly. And at first, I was like, correlation is not causation. My science brain kicked in. I'm like, no, that can't be it. but it kept nagging at me a little bit. And so when I really stopped and thought about it, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, that helped. And oh, yeah, and that helped. And over the years, I've really come to break it down into 6 solid ways, very concrete, very neuroscientific ways that mindfulness has helped me become a happier, more productive writer. And just that tagline seems to just fit so well because that's really sums it up. And I'm really excited to talk about these 6 with you. But I didn't really set out on the path of like, I'm going to meditate to become a better writer. It just kind of happened. And now that I realize how much it helped, I actually doubled down. I went and got I did a 2-year certification program through UC Berkeley to become a mindfulness teacher, and then integrated that into my writing coaching. And now I get to share that with all of my writers and watch them reap the benefits of it as well. It's been great.
That's awesome. And I love what you said too, because, some part of it is practice and it's like learning the craft. So, through studying and through actually doing and writing, you do learn the craft, but I would argue that maybe more of it is mindset, because if you're not open to changing things or experimenting or getting rejected or things like that, you're never going to learn the craft anyway. So is this something that you find with the writers you work with, that so much of it is mindset and we often don't talk about that enough?
Absolutely. Yeah. So much of it is mindset and on so many different levels too. And we can talk about that when we get into the 6 different things, but most of them are not directly related to craft. They facilitate craft, but mindfulness in and of itself isn't landing on the page. So yeah, it's so much about mindset.
Yeah. And I find there's certain people that are kind of in the woo-woo camp. Like that's me, right? I love the woo-woo and I love thinking of these like mindset hacks or like, slowing down to make more progress and things like that. But there are other people who are kind of like, I'm just going to stick to the craft, right? So I think, if you're one of those people and you're listening, I think April and I will both encourage you to have an open mind and just, think about, is the process you're currently using working? If not, maybe just try one of these things and just see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no harm in experimenting. And I always tell my writers, I come at this with such a scientific background that I really think of it more like mind hacking than mindfulness, almost. Like it is mindfulness. It is in the mindfulness tradition. But the way I've always framed it is this idea of more of like getting to know how your brain works so that you can work with it, not against it.
Right. Which is awesome. And it reminds me a lot of what like Olympic athletes have to do too. So, there's no reason why it would work for someone like that and not for a creative writer. So I think that's a great setup. So with all that, let's dive into the 6 ways. Do you want to go one by one? Do you want to recap them all first?
Let's go one by one. That's probably easiest.
Yeah. Perfect. So what's number 1? What's the first way?
Number 1 is just finding focus. Focus is in such short supply these days in our world that there's a meditation that I practice with my writers called insight meditation, where you focus on something and I usually say 10 minutes is a really good pre-writing meditation. You focus on something and you just try to notice when your mind wanders. That's all you do. You're not trying to clear your mind. You're not trying to like not think about anything. You just notice when your mind wanders, come back to the anchor over and over again. And then at the end of the 10 minutes, you change that anchor to your writing. So you start writing and you just try to notice the thoughts that come up. So like you'll be writing, and what writer hasn't had the experience of you start writing and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I need to move the laundry along, right? So if you can notice that thought and just be like, okay, I'll do that when I'm done, you let that thought go, come back to the writing, and it allows you to drop into a much deeper state of focus. And when you reach, that's how you get into flow, right? It used to be, I would write once in a while and hope, fingers crossed, for that state of flow. And now with the mindfulness practice, I can like drop into that state of flow at will and just write and write and write. And it feels fantastic.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you said the anchor, is that something like in real life on our desk? Is it, for me, is it my dog? Is it something in our head? Like, what are we focusing on?
That's a great question. And it really can be anything. I usually encourage people you can start with the breath, because we all breathe, right? So we know that the breath is there for all of us. But for some people, focusing on the breath can make it feel really tight. Like when I first started meditating, I could not focus on my breath. It made me really uncomfortable. So you can focus on the sounds in the room. You can absolutely put a pet in your lap and focus on the pet. Some people will light a candle and focus on the flame. Whatever it is that you can just come back to, whenever you notice your mind has wandered, you just come back to that anchor over and over again.
Yeah. That's great. Okay. Yeah. Because I'm one of those people that the breath thing doesn't work for me either. I start overthinking it. And I'm
Yeah.
like, am I doing this right? What is my heart rate doing? You know, I start thinking,
Why am I breathing so deep? Like, what am I doing it wrong?
Yeah. So if you're like that too, if you're listening, you know, I think there's a thing that I learned when I was dealing with anxiety a while ago. And it's like, you know, look at 5 things in the room, you know, to ground yourself and get ready to focus. You could touch 5 things. What are 5 things you see? What are 5 things you smell? Whatever. And that kind of
Yes.
helps you like center. And then, you know, it could be as simple. I have a scrunchie on my desk. I could just hold that and anchor myself with it. Be calm,
Exactly.
right? So could be anything.
It's really just about reeling in the mind, because as writers, we're particularly good at like spinning off into God knows where. I mean, we can go to other universes and dragons, like you name it. So it's just really about coming into the present moment. Where are you right now?
Yeah.
Be
That's
here.
great. I love that you're like focus on the thing and then transfer it to the writing. And I feel like that would actually flow really nicely.
Yeah.
So if that's okay, that's way number 1. I love that. What's number 2?
Okay, so number 2 is writer's block, dealing with writer's block. And it's kind of an extension of number 1. Once you start to notice those thoughts that come up, you can start to, so I don't believe in writer's block. I think it's kind of a catch-all phrase that we use to describe whatever reason we're not writing. But when we start to get better at noticing those thoughts, we can start to think like, why am I not writing? As an example, I was on a retreat one time and I was teaching at it, and I was getting up early to write on my novel before I went and taught. And my alarm went off one morning and I was like, oh, I don't want to go write. And I heard that thought in my head and I was like, I love writing. Wait, where did that thought come from? And when I stopped and I like took the thought and actually analyzed a little bit, I didn't want to go write in the space that I've been writing because it was full of like gossiping ladies and it was very distracting. I'm like, oh, well, I'll just go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so the writer's block of what that woo-woo, like magic phrase of writer's block suddenly starts to dissolve when you can notice the thoughts that are around it and be like, okay, is that really true? Or is it just, it's kind of just getting pushed into a like general, I don't feel like writing idea.
Yeah. And it could even be something like you said, because you were waking up, maybe you didn't sleep well, you know, and that doesn't really have anything to do with your desire to write or your willingness. But when you lump it together, that starts to become that pattern that you hear yourself saying, I don't feel like writing. And then that becomes true.
And that becomes the narrative of like, I guess I'm just not a writer. When really, I don't know, you had bad dreams or whatever it was.
Yeah. And the other thing I see that kind of, I feel like is in the same bucket is when there's like, let's say a plot question we have or something that's very craft and we don't want to write because we're afraid that, you know, I can't figure that out. Or what if this means my story's broken? So could this tip work for that as well?
Absolutely. And in fact, on my website, if writers are interested, I have a little mini masterclass on writer's block and where I break down the 10 things that often masquerade as writer's block. And there are probably half of them are specifically craft. Like, I don't know how to start my story. I don't know what comes next. I'm afraid people will judge me, especially if people are writing memoir or if you're basing characters on your family. Like, people are going to judge me. They're going to know I'm writing about them. And there are specific ways to deal with each of those things once you recognize what it is. If you don't recognize what it is, you're just lost out at sea and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. And usually we take that to mean something that it doesn't mean, and then it stalls all progress. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well for anyone that's interested. But okay, so that's number 2. What is the third way?
Okay, number 3 is understanding your characters better by understanding emotions better. One of the ways that mindfulness can be really helpful with this is that when we are able to touch into emotion and stay with it long enough to like find the words to describe it and get it on the page, your characters will suddenly be so much more rich and engaging. I read a lot of my clients when I first start working with them. Their stories almost kind of skim along the surface and they never really drop into the emotional content of the characters and what motivates them. And because we have been trained as humans to avoid bad emotions, we don't want to feel sad. We don't want to feel angry. So we avoid those things and we're not great at writing about them. But when we can use mindfulness to recognize or even bring to mind, like if I'm writing a character who is really angry, I will do just a short meditation where I sit quietly and try to remember a time I was really angry and then stay with it long enough to write down the words that describe that emotion. Like, what does it feel like in your body when you're really angry or really sad or really in love or whatever that emotion is? We need to be able to slow down and recognize those emotions, describe them with words. And that I think is one of the hardest parts because we all feel those things, but to actually put them in words that are true and specific and not cliche placeholders, but like real writing,
Yeah.
real descriptions.
And that's super interesting too, because I agree that a lot of the drafts I see, they do skim along the surface. And sometimes it's what you said, that it's just like we're trained not to feel these quote unquote negative or bad things, whatever you want to call them, which for the record, no bad emotions in my belief.
Right.
But yeah, it's like we're trained to not do that. And then also sometimes it's hard if we've been betrayed or if we've
Yeah,
experienced that, we don't really want to revisit it because that's not fun. The other
exactly.
thing too is that a lot of the times when we do create something that affects people emotionally, it has to do with complex emotions. And those are hard to write because it could
Yeah.
be you're feeling angry and you want to like go jog a mile and you're like, where did this even come from? Right.
Yeah.
So it's like capturing all the complexities of the emotion and feeling the things. So yeah, it's a lot. But I do love this point that noticing it and just like, what does it feel like emotionally, physically? What do I do when I'm in that state? Definitely will
Yeah.
help you write more authentic emotions.
Yeah. And being able to choose which emotions that you give to a character, and that I find makes writing conflict much easier because you can choose. So people tend to fall in different camps, right? Like my camp is definitely fear of abandonment. Like that's me.
Yeah.
But so if I'm writing a character who is more like me and has a fear of abandonment, and I feel like it needs a little more conflict, then I give the other character a fear of commitment. And like you
Yeah.
put those two characters in a room together, and there's going to be some conflict, and it's
Right.
it's not even just better for the writer, it makes it easier, but it's also better for your reader. It becomes much
Right.
more dynamic and interesting.
Yeah. And I also find too that sometimes that messiness that comes with emotions or that like, a character might be aware they're feeling something, but they don't know why yet, because there's an
Yeah.
arc and all that. That also makes it more relatable because people, like you and I, we sometimes don't understand our own emotions. And we're
Yes.
stuck in that place of like, I feel so bad. Why do I feel this way? Maybe it's this. And then we might have it wrong or, you know.
Yeah.
So I think just that whole awareness of it will definitely help you write more three-dimensional, authentic characters.
Yes.
Okay,
Uh,
so that was number 3, right? And now we're on number
Yes.
4, which is what?
And number 4 is also very closely related, but it's getting comfortable with discomfort.
Yeah.
And it very much like you were saying of like, it's on these quote unquote bad emotions can be really uncomfortable. And a story without conflict is not much of a story. So we have to learn to write into that discomfort. And there's a very specific meditation for this one where it's basically the same meditation I described before, where you focus on an anchor and just notice when your mind wanders, but with one little caveat. Once you have settled in and said, okay, I've started my meditation, you try for however long you've decided to meditate. And I use a little timer. I think timers are great for this. But okay, for 10 minutes, I'm going to try not to move at all. And what happens is like even just saying that, I get a little itch on the back of my head. I notice there's a little strand of hair in my face and I really want to move it. My foot suddenly, like, I need to just shift my foot just a little.
Yeah.
And it's really so much harder than it sounds to just sit perfectly still for 10 minutes in your own head, because you will have these thoughts. But when you can practice not just reacting, when you can practice being uncomfortable, and I say uncomfortable, not in pain. I always like to put the little asterisk
Caveat.
that like, if you're in pain, move, please take care of yourself. But for little minor discomforts, if you can practice just sitting with them, what does it feel like to like notice that itch and just see if it eventually fades, or does it shift, or does it get worse? And try not to scratch it. You can actually build the muscle of being comfortable with discomfort, which will help you write more difficult scenes more effectively.
That's great. And I think it's like sitting in the discomfort, noticing it, but also not judging that discomfort, because it's really easy to say, if we're in a negative headspace, I couldn't even sit still for 5 minutes. What's wrong with me? No wonder I can't write a book, right? So
Right.
it's kind of like that's not the point. The point is practice and getting in the habit of these mindfulness exercises and habits to become a better writer, not to prove that we are not capable of becoming better writers.
Exactly. Well, and I think that kindness part is so important. Let's pause there for a second, because when even just in the meditation, as I've described it, where you're sitting and you're focused on something and your mind wanders, and apparently it's a very American thing, but we like to beat ourselves up. We do this like, I'm so stupid. Why can't I even stay focused on anything for 5 minutes or even 30 seconds? Like I just refocused and now my mind's running off again. And I always like to tell my writers, minds think. That's what they do. We don't want them to stop. And the goal is never to clear our minds or to sit without a thought. It is simply to notice the thoughts. And with kindness come back to the anchor and begin again. When we bring kindness into it, we're actually allowing ourselves to see the truth of it, which is just that minds wander. That's what they do. If we beat ourselves up, you head into what the Buddhist philosophy would call delusion. It's not true that you're stupid if your mind wanders. In fact, it's probably the opposite. Your mind is working just like it's supposed to. So bringing that kindness in is such an important thing. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. And just it's something that helps me personally is, let's say I'm writing and I'm having these judgmental thoughts about myself. I have to sometimes say, okay, if someone else was telling me they're having these thoughts, I would never, ever treat them the way that I'm treating myself, right? Like if April was having these thoughts and she came to me and said, Savannah, can we talk about this? I would never say, you know what, April, it's kind of stupid. I don't think you're cut out to be a writer, right? So why do we do that to ourselves? I think sometimes that's enough to get us out of our head and be like, yeah, this is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And just be kind. Practice kindness with yourself first and foremost.
Self-compassion. Yeah. Okay. So then what is number 5?
Number 5, editing more effectively. And this I extrapolated from the Buddhist concept of right view, which is this idea of seeing things as they really are. And I've applied it to writing in the idea that so in the Buddhist philosophy, it's about the mental overlay that we bring to a conversation. Where if I walk into the kitchen and my husband says, I thought you were going to unload the dishwasher, and I start being like, well, I had to take the kids to school, like all I'm clearly bringing my own overlay of like, I think he's judging me, so I'm defensive and blah, blah. Whereas I could be like, oh, I didn't have time. Like, that's really all that I needed to say. Yeah. And so the way that applies to our writing is trying to see what we have written without all the mental overlay of what we think we have written or what's in our minds that isn't quite on the page yet. And I have a fun story about this. When I was working on my second novel, the opening scene, I had envisioned my main character being born in this storm. And it was like thunder and lightning and the trees lashing and like big fat raindrops landing in the mud. And I wrote that, and I tend to write through the whole draft. So I wrote the draft, I come back to edit, and I open up the page expecting to read this great scene that I'd written. And what I had written was, it was raining.
Yeah. So not quite the storm you envisioned.
That is not what's in my head. But if I hadn't been able to recognize that what was on the page wasn't in my head, then I wouldn't have been able to slow down and edit in that spot. And that was clearly needed editing because it wasn't what I wanted it to be. I ended up cutting the whole thing. It didn't matter. But yeah, trying to see things as they are on the page. When I started implementing that in my editing, I went from doing like 12, 13 drafts to doing 3 drafts and a final polish. Like, it shortened the number of rounds I did dramatically, and such a game changer in terms of getting to done on something, because we all tend to get impatient. We're human. Yeah.
We want things to go faster. I think this is a good tip, especially for those who, like, you're getting feedback from other people. And maybe sometimes we tend to take feedback, as like a judgment or as something's wrong. But part of why I like feedback is it helps you see, okay, this part doesn't make sense to me. And the writer might know the answer. You're like, well, she's doing that because of X. And it's like, okay, great. Put that on the page because we don't get that. So on this podcast, we talk about it as the writer's burden of knowledge. Like, we know everything, right? And the reader doesn't. So sometimes if you do have trouble getting feedback, or if it makes you feel a little defensive, I like how April just said, like, look, it's going to help you get from 13 drafts to 3 maybe, or whatever. But it also helps you see those spots where you think you're putting it on the page and you're not. So maybe I just love the way you said it. It could help reframe some of our feelings on getting feedback like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Feedback is hard. And that's a really great segue actually into number 6, which is just the emotional part of being a writer and rolling with the punches of taking feedback, of getting rejection, because rejection will always be a part of it, of dealing with the insecurity and that inner critic voice. So the imposter syndrome, I call a cousin of the inner critic, and it never gets tired of telling you how bad you are. If you haven't had anything published yet, it'll tell you, stop bothering, why, nobody's going to like your writing. Then you get something published and it's like, well, it was just a little short story. And then you get a novel published and it's like, well, but it wasn't like a New York Times bestseller. And then you'll publish a New York Times bestseller, and that little voice says, well, wait till you write your next book and they'll know you're a fraud. Like, that voice will never run out of things to say. And so learning to just recognize it, give a little internal bow and be like, okay, you're excused. I don't need your input right now. Where that little voice is great is when you're editing.
Yeah.
And that's why I always tell my writers, like, you can't murder your inner critic. You need it to be there when it's time to be critical. But any other time, you just let it go. And yes, writing is hard. There are going to be all these things that go with it. And sometimes when it really hurts, like, you just have to give yourself a space for it. Like, there definitely have been rejections where, like, oh, I really thought I was going to get that one, like some grant or writer thing, like retreat, or on those ones that really hurt. Sometimes I have to step away from my computer and get a bowl of ice cream, and I just watch Netflix for the rest of the day. But for me, the important part is setting an end date to that. So like when I step away from my computer, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take today. Or sometimes I just need an hour, or sometimes I need a week. Like it just depends on how much it hurts. But putting it in my head of like, I'm just going to wallow as much as I need to until X. And then I'm going to pick myself up and I'm going to get back to it because, writer's right. It's what you got to do.
And I think sometimes, like we keep saying, we take rejections and things like that to mean something. And it could mean so many things. Like we could, if we're querying and we get 2 rejections or whatever it is, it's like maybe they were full for the year, or maybe, it could have been a silly mistake. Like maybe they don't represent your genre or something like that. But without some of the details and the feedback we receive from things like querying, or if we're entering a short story competition and we don't get those reasons, we tend to go to the worst case scenario and blame ourselves. And so it's a good reminder that it's not always, our thoughts are not always reality.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, they're almost always warped in some way, some little way because it goes through the interpretation of your brain, which is a summation of all of your experiences in your whole life, all the conditioning you've been through. So yeah, it's very hard to see things just as they are and not lay over the like, well, I'm not good enough, or they didn't like me, or whatever that narrative might be. Yeah.
And I love that you said you give yourself time and space to deal with like the sadness or the whatever that comes with it, because it's okay to feel that way. Like it's very okay to be sad that you got rejected or you didn't win a competition or whatever. Totally fine.
It's totally normal. Yeah.
Totally normal. Totally fine. I think I love your end date, because if you're sitting in it for 3 months, maybe not that healthy, but again, it depends on everything else, right?
Yeah, it really does. And for me, the joy is in the writing. So I think the shame would be if I let that take me away from my writing for too long. That would be where like I have a little heartbreak around that. And ultimately, we write. You get back to writing. Yeah. And start the next project.
I like to kind of zoom out and say, okay, like if we are an athlete or something, right, there might be physical pain that comes with the training. There might be sacrificing like other things in your life to make time and space for the training or whatever. They do it because they love it. And so we write because we love it. And I love that you said the shame would be in stopping. So sometimes it's like we have to, I think some writers show up and they think it's all going to be fun. It's all going to be sunshine, and things like that. And then when one little hiccup happens, it's like, oh, great, I'm the problem. It's pretty normal. It's just part of the process. It doesn't have to mean anything other than like, look at the fact of it. It's not the fact plus the whole world thinks you're terrible. It's like, your short story didn't make it in the magazine. Okay, we'll try again. It's just a neutral fact.
Well, and one of the things I think that makes it really tricky for writers is that it's really hard to know if you're good enough. If you submitted a contest, it could be that the readers were having a bad day. It could be that your story wasn't good enough. Yeah. And when that little voice kicks in of like, well, and you pause, like, okay, am I really not good enough? If I'm not sure, and writing is so,
yes, very
subjective. That most popular book in the world has people who hate it. So it's very subjective. But if you're not sure, if you're feeling insecure about being a quote unquote good enough writer, there's so many opportunities, like listening to this podcast or getting a book on craft or taking a course or joining a writing. There's so many ways that you can actually work on your craft as you're going, so that if that is what it comes down to, of like, I feel like I'm not good enough, well, then work on that.
Right.
I got literally laughed out of a workshop once for a sex scene that I wrote. It was so bad, but it was my best effort, and it was not good. And everyone in the class, when they read it, they laughed and they were like, "Oh, you were kidding, right?" And I was like, "Oh no, I wasn't kidding.
Totally kidding."
I did. I played it off like super cool. I was like, "Yeah, it's a joke." And then I went home and I like read up on like how to write sex scenes. I took a class. I read some romance novels. I was like, I am not going to let this be the thing that ruins my book for people. Like, I'm going to get better at it. And so you do.
Yeah. And I think those are hard scenes to write. So are fight scenes, right? I always kind of group the two things together and people are like, yeah, they're kind of not the same. They kind of are though, because it's like choreography, emotion, things that go into it. But it's a very specific thing, like a thriller writer. If you're used to writing the more action scenes, and then let's say that you're going to include a sex scene in your novel, of course you've never done it before. Of course you need to, figure out how to do it. The same is true for writing anything. So yeah, I think it's kindness and self-compassion is the answer for sure. These 6 tips and these six ways to incorporate mindfulness into your writing practice. Even if you just implement one of them now and you save the rest on your list for later, I think it's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah. And the actual practical meditation for number 6, I didn't tell it. I gotta share it real quick. It's called compassion practice or loving kindness compassion practice. And you can look them up. They're all over YouTube. They're all over, like, the meditation apps have tons of them. And often it's just about repeating a phrase of like, may I be happy? May I be healthy? Just wishing yourself well. And it's a little different than affirmations, but the phrases kind of become the anchor. So instead of focusing on the breath or a candle, you focus on these phrases of like, may I be happy? May I be successful? May I enjoy my life? And then you have that loop of internal dialogue to push into the space. Whenever you start beating yourself up over something, you can be like, nope, may I be happy? May I be successful? May I live a life of ease? And you have this tool that then you can press into your brain when you're feeling like you're going on a downward spiral. So definitely look one of those up. Compassion practice, loving kindness practice. They're all over the place and they're definitely worth exploring.
I love that. And for anyone who's listening that thinks like, oh, that sounds really hard to just push into the part of your brain that's negative, I think a good starting point is at least give equal weight to the negative and the positive. Yeah. So if you can't quite because I know some people out there are like, yeah, that sounds good, but I can't make myself believe or buy into the may I be happy if I don't feel that way, right? So if you're thinking I'm a terrible writer or I'm going to be rejected for this, equal airtime for that kind of thought would be but what if I'm not, right? What if this is the query letter that gets me a deal? Or what if I'm actually not terrible and I just need to get better at dialogue? So, sometimes if you can't get all the way to 100, aim for 50-50.
Yeah. Or even the tiniest start. I heard a woman talking about bringing this kind of meditation into her body image. And she was really working on trying to be nicer to herself and not having a lot of luck. And so she would just try to catch herself whenever she looked in the mirror and said something mean to herself. She would add on to the end, but I love you.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, your arms are so flabby, but I love you. And that was kind of her gateway into starting to just recognizing those thoughts and bringing in a little bit of self-love, even if she couldn't get rid of the negative thoughts just yet. And then over time, you start to wear them away. But anything you can do to just bring in just a little bit of love for yourself.
I love that. So it's the sentence is kind of cliche, but I love you.
Yes,
exactly. You're doing great.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. So could you recap those 6 just really quick for people?
Sure, absolutely. So number 1 is finding focus, and that was with the insight meditation that we talked about. Number 2 is getting past writer's block, which we take that insight meditation and try to notice the thoughts that we have just grouped as writer's block so we can actually do something about them. Number 3 is understanding our characters better. So slowing down, taking a moment to notice the emotions that are coming up, which ties very closely to number 4, which is getting comfortable with discomfort. Same meditation, but trying not to move and just accepting that challenge as best we can and starting to train ourselves to be comfortable with discomfort so we can dip into those emotions and write them more effectively. Number 5 was editing more effectively, which is trying to see what's on the page without the mental overlay of what we intended to be on the page so that we can edit in fewer drafts. And number 6 is just rolling with the punches of being a writer, trying to bring in kindness as much as we can so that we don't get burned out and discouraged and quit writing.
I love that. Those are 6 wonderful tips, wonderful things we can integrate. What would you say if we're going to kind of bring all this to one final parting takeaway? I'm thinking of the writers who, whether they've been trying to do this for years or if they're just brand new to it and they're stuck. So they're so frozen, they can't even make any kind of progress. What are some parting words of wisdom about that?
I really think community is key on writing and meditation and pretty much anything we're trying to do in our lives. So if you are feeling stuck, I think reaching out to other writers, whether it's a writing coach or it's a writing group or community, whatever it is. But there's something magical about just getting with other people. And if the mindfulness thing is something that's appealing, I have a group that integrates mindfulness in writing, but it doesn't have to be something like that. I just think whenever we're stuck in life in general, reaching out to touch base with other people is the fastest, most effective way to get unstuck, whatever you're dealing with.
That's great. I totally agree. And it's you'll see things like, they're going to be inspirational. They're going to have wisdom to share with you, but also you're going to see that you're not alone in your struggles, which sometimes helps take that, discomfort, like you were saying earlier, get uncomfortable with the discomfort because everybody feels it, right? So I do think that's a great tip. Community is wonderful, especially for the lone writer. So I love that. Thank you for sharing. Now, where can people find you and your, articles on mindfulness and all these things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I'm everywhere as April Dávila. So it's aprildavila.com. And on my homepage, I actually have a download that is, I think it's 4 ways mindfulness can make you a happier, healthier writer. I need to update it. I have 6 now.
Yeah.
but there is a PDF people can download if they want to look at that. My groups are on there. I'm on Instagram as April Dávila. I'm pretty easy to find.
Perfect. And we'll grab all those links to the specific things you talked about, as well as just your website and your Instagram and things like that. And we'll put them in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, April. I know this is going to be a listener favorite episode. We love our mindset tips over here. So I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great conversation.
So that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in and for showing your support. If you're an Apple user, I'd really appreciate it if you took a few seconds to leave a rating and a review. Your ratings and reviews tell Apple that this is a podcast that's worth listening to. And in turn, your reviews will help get this podcast in front of more fiction writers just like you. As always, I'll be back next week with a brand new episode full of actionable tips, tools, and strategies to help you become a better writer and craft a story you're proud of. Until then, happy writing.